The leather creaked under her hand as she pulled the cinch tight, and the horse shied back a step, exhaling a white cloud into the cold air. She didn't let go of the strap. She dug her heels into the damp earth, gritted her teeth, and pulled again. The animal finally yielded. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. "Do you know how to ride?" he asked from the fence, arms crossed over the worn wooden post. She didn't turn immediately. She finished adjusting the saddle, ran her hand down the horse's flank as if she'd known him her whole life, and only then looked at him. "I learned before I learned to walk properly," she said. "My father used to say a horse never lies about who's riding him." He lowered his gaze, and something in his chest shifted in a way he couldn't yet name. Ashford Hollow Farm stretched across a low hill, surrounded by fences that had once been straight, and which time had gradually curved, like everything else in that place. It was the autumn of 1879, though the years there weren't counted so much by numbers as by harvests. The year of the long drought, the year of the winter that killed the young livestock, the year the river almost took the bridge. Caleb Whitmore was 32 years old, and his name was spoken by the townspeople with a mixture of respect and pity. Respect because he had shouldered his father's farm since he was 19, when the man died of a fever no one could name in time. Pity because, in all those years, Caleb hadn't found the time, or perhaps hadn't allowed himself, for anything other than work. His hands were calloused, the hands of someone who mends things with whatever is at hand, a twisted wire serving as a hinge, a piece of leather patching a bridle. He didn't talk much. When someone asked him how he was, he'd reply, "We're getting by," as if life were a wagon that just needed to keep rolling. He didn't allow himself to think about what was missing. He had learned, without anyone teaching him, that desiring things he couldn't have was a luxury his land couldn't afford. What weighed him down, in addition to the work, was an old silence. The promise he'd made to his dying father not to let the farm be lost, no matter the cost. And the cost, until now, had been everything else. That autumn, two things changed the routine of Ashford Hollow. The first was the news that the county bank would review land mortgages in the spring, and Caleb's, 2 years overdue and silent, was among them. The second was the arrival of Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor wasn't entirely new. She had spent her childhood summers on the neighboring farm, her Aunt Margaret's, before her family moved east, to a city with cobblestone streets and a father who preferred numbers to horses. Caleb remembered her from then, a skinny girl with messy braids who ran faster than any boy in the county, and who once broke his cousin's lip for calling her weak. Now, at 28, Eleanor had returned. Her Aunt Margaret had fallen ill, and someone had to take care of the farm while she recovered. Eleanor had volunteered without hesitation, to the surprise of her family, who thought she was already settled into a life of drawing rooms and manners. What no one in the city knew, what not even Eleanor fully admitted to herself, was that for years she had felt her life there was a borrowed dress, fitting in all the wrong places. The first day they saw each other again, after 14 years, Eleanor was perched on the Whitmore fence, trying to reach a cat that refused to come down from a tree. Caleb found her like that, her dress stained with dirt, her hair escaping her bun, quietly cursing at the animal. "You haven't changed a bit," he said, and it was the closest to a joke he'd uttered in months. "Neither of you," she replied, without looking at him, still focused on the cat. You're still just standing there, watching instead of helping." He climbed up to get the cat. She laughed, a short, genuine laugh, and something in that sound stayed with him for the rest of the day, like a splinter that didn't hurt but that you noticed every time you moved. What neither of them said aloud was this: they recognized each other, not just as the people they had been as children, but as something more immediate and more dangerous. Caleb saw in her the same stubbornness he admired in himself, but without the bitterness that he had let cling to him over the years. Eleanor saw in him a quietness that wasn't weakness, but a strength that didn't need to be proven. Neither of them called out the other's name. Not yet. The weeks that followed wove a routine that seemed casual and wasn't. Aunt Margaret's farm bordered Caleb's, separated only by a shallow creek and a path the animals had made long before people. Eleanor began to cross that path with a frequency she justified with increasingly weak reasons. "I need to borrow the big wagon," she'd say, even though hers worked perfectly fine. "Do you have extra salt?" she'd ask, even though her aunt's pantry was full. Caleb, for his part, started finding his own excuses. He repaired the boundary fence more often than necessary. He left his gate open, just in case, though he never said just in case of what. One afternoon, she arrived with her wagon stuck in the mud after the rain, and he pulled it out without being asked, his boots sunk to his ankles, without a single complaint. When he finished, Eleanor offered him a handkerchief for his dirty hands, and he refused. But he watched as she, without saying anything else, wiped a smudge of mud from his cheek with the back of her fingers. Neither of them commented on the gesture. They both remembered it that night, separately, staring at the ceiling. Another day, Caleb arrived at Margaret's farm before dawn, without being asked, because he knew Eleanor had to milk alone, and the stable needed a new roof before the first frost arrived. He worked for 3 hours without saying a word about why he was there. When she came down and found him on the roof, she stood there for a long moment, watching him, before bringing him hot coffee without him asking. "You didn't have to do this," she said, handing him the mug. "I know," he replied, and offered no further explanation. That was enough for both of them. But what neither of them knew yet was that these small habits, the coffee, the fence, the mud on his cheek, were becoming the foundations of something neither of them had consciously decided to build, and that would be much harder to abandon than either of them imagined. There was one Sunday afternoon when Caleb taught Eleanor how to shoe a horse, something she insisted on learning even though he assured her it wasn't a woman's work. She replied, without looking up from the hoof she held between her knees, that work had no sex, only willing hands to do it. Caleb didn't argue. He sat beside her and showed her how to file the edge, his hand over hers for just long enough to correct the angle, then withdrew it as if he had touched something hot. That night, they both slept poorly, for reasons neither dared to name to themselves yet. Psychologist Arthur Aron, in his studies on interpersonal closeness in the 1990s, discovered that shared and repeated physical proximity, even in mundane tasks, generates deeper emotional bonds than grand declarations, because the body learns trust before the mind puts words to it. The trouble arrived with the name Walter Briggs. Walter was the son of the county bank owner, a man of polished manners and hands that had never touched a tool of labor. He had set his sights on Eleanor from the first time he saw her at church, newly arrived, with that city air he mistook for elegance, and she knew was just discomfort. Walter began visiting Margaret's farm with small gifts, a book of poetry, a box of sweets brought from the county capital. Eleanor received them with cold courtesy, but her Aunt Margaret, still convalescing, saw in Walter a security that Margaret herself had never had, and began to encourage him unashamedly. "He's a good man, Eleanor. He has a future, not like—" She didn't finish the sentence, but it wasn't necessary. Eleanor knew exactly who she was comparing him to. The pressure wasn't just social. It was financial. Walter's father, the bank's majority owner, was the same man who would decide in a few months whether Caleb's mortgage would be extended or foreclosed. Walter knew this, and he began to use it, with the subtlety of someone who never has to get his hands dirty to win. "It would be a shame," he commented one evening at dinner, in front of Eleanor and her aunt, "if certain lands were to change owners in the spring. Although, of course, if there were close family ties to the bank, those things sometimes resolve more kindly." Eleanor understood the message with a clarity that made her stomach churn. Her future with Walter didn't just mean a comfortable life. It meant, indirectly, the salvation or ruin of Caleb's farm. She couldn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, looking towards the neighboring farm, where a single light remained on late as always. She thought about how easy it would be to simply accept Walter, to resolve everything with a practical decision. She thought about how impossible it would be to live the rest of her life knowing she had chosen comfort over truth. Caleb, for his part, began to notice Walter's carriages in front of Margaret's farm, with a frequency that tightened something in his chest he preferred not to examine. He started to pull away. He stopped crossing the path. He repaired the fence one last time and invented no more excuses. "Did I do something wrong?" Eleanor asked him one afternoon, finally finding him at the property line after almost 2 weeks of silence. "No," he replied, without fully looking at her. "But I have work to attend to, Eleanor, and you have your life, which seems to be sorting itself out well without me getting in the way." "Is that what you think you're doing? Getting out of the way?" He didn't answer. She left before he could see that she was on the verge of tears, and he remained there, standing, jaw clenched, feeling that he had just made the wrong decision, and without knowing how to undo it. The following weeks were the longest either of them could remember. The bank sent Caleb a formal notification. If he didn't make a significant payment before the first snow, they would begin foreclosure proceedings in the spring. Caleb read it twice, folded it, and put it in the drawer where he kept everything he didn't know how to solve. Walter, meanwhile, proposed to Eleanor at a formal dinner in front of her entire family, with a ring that weighed more in intention than in gold. Eleanor didn't answer immediately. She asked for time. Walter, confident in his position, granted it with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. That night, Eleanor walked alone to the creek that separated the two farms, the same one she had crossed so many times without thinking. She sat on the bank in the darkness, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to cry without holding anything back. She didn't know how much time passed until she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know whose they were. Caleb sat down beside her, not too close, his hands hanging between his knees. "I saw your lamplight moving towards the creek," he said, as the only explanation. "You're going to lose the farm," she said, bluntly, without looking at him. "Probably." "And you're not going to do anything?" "What do you want me to do, Eleanor? Go beg Walter's father? Ask you to marry his son to save my land?" His voice broke on the last word, something she had never heard from him. I've been holding this alone for 13 years. I don't know how to do anything else. I never asked you to do it alone. The silence that followed had a different weight than all the previous ones. Do you know what I think sometimes? She said finally. I think you're so afraid of asking for help that you've confused silence with strength, and everyone around you confuses it with you. Caleb didn't respond, but something in his chest, something that had been closed for 13 years with the same stubbornness with which he held the farm, shifted for the first time. That was the night something, finally, began to break in him. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, but something slower. The uncomfortable and late realization that he had spent so long protecting the land that he had forgotten to protect himself, and to protect the only thing he could truly lose that wasn't listed on any bank paper. What do you think Caleb did the next morning? What he did was show up at Margaret's house before dawn, not with flowers or rehearsed words, but with a concrete idea: to sell the northern half of his land, the less fertile part, to a buyer from the neighboring county who had been interested for months. It wasn't enough to save everything, but it was enough to stop the foreclosure and buy time. It meant reducing the farm his father had left him. It meant admitting in front of everyone that he couldn't hold it all alone. He told Eleanor before anyone else, standing in the doorway of her aunt's kitchen, his hat between his hands like a man who didn't know what to do with them. I'm going to sell the north part, he said. I'll talk to Holloway tomorrow. Why are you telling me? Because I want you to know I'm not doing it for the farm. I'm doing it because I'm tired of choosing land above everything else. And because I don't want you to marry Walter Briggs thinking you're saving my life by doing so. Eleanor felt the air catch in her chest. Caleb, let me finish, he said. And for the first time in his life, the words came out without him having to tear them from himself. I tied you to a path between two farms for weeks because it was easier than telling you what I felt out loud. I was afraid of needing something again. My father needed my mother, and when she died, I watched him fade slowly for years. I thought if I never wanted anything like that, I could never lose it like that. But I lost you anyway, just slowly, through my own silence. Eleanor said nothing for a moment that seemed eternal. She just looked at him, truly looked at him, as if seeing him whole for the first time. Walter offered me an easy life, she finally said. You've offered me the truth, even if it cost you everything. My whole life has been in places where people say the right words without feeling them. And you say almost nothing, but every word you say, you feel it to the bone. That's not a yes. No, she said, and smiled. A small, trembling smile. It's something better. It's stay, and let's figure it out together, without either of us having to lose anything to deserve the other. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with everything neither of them had known how to say until that moment. The news spread through the county faster than any letter from the bank. Eleanor rejected Walter with a brief, firm letter that her Aunt Margaret read with a mixture of surprise and, finally, a silent pride she had never shown before. Walter, wounded more in his pride than his heart, withdrew with the same coldness with which he had arrived, and his father, without his son's personal motivation, ended up granting a reasonable extension on Caleb's mortgage in exchange for the already agreed-upon land sale. It wasn't a magical solution. It was work, for months. Caleb and Eleanor rebuilt what was left of the farm together, this time without pretending each could do it alone. She learned to keep the account books, something he had never been good at. He learned, slowly, clumsily, to say what he felt without it getting stuck in his throat. They married in the spring, at the same fence where they had found each other again, with a cat, perhaps the same one, perhaps another, watching the ceremony from a nearby tree, as if approving with feline indifference. They built their life with the same small habits that had united them without them realizing it. The coffee she brought him to the stable each morning without him asking. The fence he kept repairing even though it was no longer necessary, just because he liked the rhythm of work done with his hands, when he knew for whom he was doing it. They argued, like any real couple, but neither of them ever kept silent again about what truly mattered. 31 years later, on an autumn afternoon similar to that first one, a young woman climbed the same fence at Ashford Hollow, trying to reach a cat that refused to come down from a tree. "Do you know how to ride?" a young man asked her, leaning against the same worn post, unaware that he was repeating, almost word for word, a question asked 3 decades ago. The woman, the daughter of Eleanor and Caleb, turned with the same crooked smile as her mother and replied something her father had taught her to say if anyone ever asked her the same question with that particular look. From the porch, 2 older people watched the scene without saying anything. Caleb, his hair now gray and his hands more callous than ever, took Eleanor's hand without looking at her, a gesture so automatic after 3 decades that he no longer needed to think about it. She intertwined her fingers with his and rested her head on his shoulder, smelling the same scent of leather and earth that she had learned to associate with the word home, long before she knew that was the correct word. "She's going to say yes," Eleanor murmured, watching her daughter. "Probably," Caleb replied, with that same economy of words as always, though now, after so many years, she knew exactly what those few words carried within them. Because in the end, the truest love stories aren't built with grand speeches or with gestures meant to be remembered. They are built with coffees brought without being asked for, with fences repaired over and over, with silences that someone finally dares to break. They are built, above all, with the quiet courage of choosing each other, day after day, even when it would be easier not to. And somewhere, on a farm that exists no longer than in stories like this, a horse is still waiting for someone willing to learn that riding, after all, was never just a matter of hands.